Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fanfic reread project. Fucking cars. In this episode, we are going to be continuing our reread of Batman Begins. Jesus Christ. Like I said last episode, we are moving into the back 2/3 of the story. I am going to stop numbering the chapters here because it's very likely that I'm going to forget. Especially because we read multiple chapters and I don't always do these every day. And then, like, the next episode, I'll be like, it's chapter 12. And then the next one after that, I'll be like, okay, let's read chapter 11. We are going to begin this section with a Bruce chapter. Bruce returned to Gotham with a clearer mind than he had ever. Jesus. Bruce returned to Gotham with a clearer mind than he ever had. I think the problem there is that my brain added a had after he because the rest of the sentence is in that same tense. But anyway, the city was always a place of constant metamorphosis, and the mansion wasn't exempt from this, but this time around the house felt welcoming where it had once been intimidating. The silence and emptiness used to feel oppressive, but now they were comforting. Even his parents' bedroom, well, it was his now, felt warmer than it had before. He felt more at home than he ever had. Here's the thing. I mentioned last episode, probably for a lot longer than I needed to, that cities do definitely change quite a bit, even just in 1 year, let alone 4. However, I feel like when Bruce comes to the mansion and he's like, oh, the mansion has changed so much, it doesn't really seem like it has. Like, it has all of the same furniture and decorations that it had before. Yet, he's like, oh, it's changed. I think what really is happening is he, in his attitude toward the house and his family, is changing. And he interprets that as the mansion changing. And I kind of like that. I don't know if I did it on purpose. I'm thinking that I must have done it on purpose, though, because there's no way I hadn't noticed that every time he comes back, the decorations are exactly the same, yet he's like, oh, it's so different. But moving on. Bruce lay on his stomach under the thick covers of his bed, his eyes trained on a copy of that day's newspaper. The heavy golden embroidery on the surface shined in the bright afternoon sun. He had pulled them out as soon as he got back home. They were always his favorite. Are you staying for long, sir? Alfred asked, dusting the window. He was into his 70s now, but he didn't look a day over 60. Pin that. We'll come back to it, in a few rereads. As long as it takes. He took Alfred's silence as confusion. I want to show the people of Gotham that the city doesn't belong to the corrupt. During the Depression, Alfred began, your father nearly bankrupted Wayne Enterprises combating poverty. He believed his example would inspire the wealthy to save their city. Did it? In a way, he said, looking down. Their deaths shocked them into action. People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, Bruce said. He turned towards the window, leaning his head on his hand. I can't do this as Bruce Wayne, though. I'm just a man. They can ignore me or try to stop me. But a symbol... Symbols last forever. What symbol, sir? I don't know yet. Something scary. So reading the dialogue in this part is really making me think of those moments in, is it chapter 8? The last flashback chapter, where I deliberately changed the dialogue because I was like, oh, this is too formal. We need to make it more, like, casual or just to fit the characters better. Why didn't I do that here? I think I said this already, but I just feel like even though, for as much as I disliked Nolan's style of writing or whatever, I didn't do the work to actually go through and change all of the dialogue and make it into something that I thought was acceptable. At the same time, though, so far, some of the original dialogue moments outside of the stuff from the first flashback chapter, they have been kind of like childish. So maybe it was better that I didn't change it. But let's keep going. Alfred took a sip of his tea. I assume that, since you're taking on the underworld, this symbol is a persona to protect those you care about from reprisals? Or at least I think that's how you say that word. You're thinking about Rachel, Bruce asked back immediately. Actually, sir, I was thinking of myself. Bruce smiled. Have you told anybody I'm back? Alfred became slightly tense. I haven't figured out the legal ramifications of raising you from the dead. Bruce leaned his head to the side. It's been 7 years. Bruce sat up. You had me declared dead? Actually, it was Mr. Earl. Bruce only vaguely remembered him. He'd kept out of Wayne Tower in the past. He wanted to liquidate your majority shareholding. He's taking the company public. Your shares brought in an enormous amount of capital. A good thing I left everything to you, then. Quite so, sir. You're welcome to borrow the rolls, by the way, Alfred said on his way out of the door. Just bring it back with a full tank. So I do think it's interesting that that scene in the movie happens on the plane on the way back from Bhutan, I think is where Bruce was, not entirely sure. But here it happens when Bruce is already back in Gotham. That's just a simple like change so that I don't have to write them being on the plane and then getting back, and like it was to cut the amount of content that would be in this chapter. Beyond that, I don't really have all that much to say about what we just read. It's really nothing special. He sat on the floor of the study later that day with a pile of photographs scattered in front of him. He found himself around Falcone's nightclub with amazing regularity the last month or so. There were a few of Rachel, too. The district attorney's office was getting heavier traffic these days. The dark-colored suit she wore made her seem like a completely different person, but she still looked beautiful as ever. I don't know if I've ever commented on this any of the other times I've read through this, but it's kind of creepy that he just has pictures of Rachel. I know it's like, oh, he's taken pictures of the people in the district attorney's office, but like, why Rachel? It's very unimportant. We are going to have some talks about Bruce's feelings towards Rachel and that entire relationship as we read not only through this, but through the next two stories as well, because there's just some suspect stuff here, but it's all part of Bruce's arc and stuff. Also, speaking of that, notice how when Alfred is like, oh, I'm assuming this symbol is so that the people in your life can avoid reprisals, he immediately thinks of Rachel and not, his other three friends that we were introduced to in the last flashback chapter. Like, I understand that, yes, this would affect Rachel too. But, okay, number one, yeah, he doesn't think of, like, Alfred. But also, like, your other three friends who also have jobs that are kind of important, and only one of them really has money to fall back on that could, like, come back from getting, like, in trouble with something like this. You might want to... It's just very strange. Anyway. The sound of footsteps in the hall tore his attention from his work, but as soon as he looked up, they'd stopped. Alfred was out in the hall with a tray in his hand, but he was staring at something in the corner. The sound of a squeak got him to his feet. A blessed bat, sir, Alfred said when he passed through the doorway. The thing had gripped its tiny claws onto the arm of the light fixture and wrapped its bony wings around itself. Even as it sat still, the sight of it made him slightly uncomfortable. I think they nest somewhere on the grounds, Alfred told him. The image of the large hole in the wall of the well came to mind. He went to grab his coat. He walked across the gardens to the greenhouse, the same trail he'd taken so many times before in his dreams. The flower beds were empty now, and the paint on the greenhouse was long gone, leaving the iron to rust. Glass was broken where it wasn't completely missing, and the old tables were gone as well. He moved right through the slightly decrepit-looking place to the well he knew was on the other side. Slightly decrepit? Everything's gone and all the glass is broken or missing. What? Years of disuse left it covered in overgrowth. The mouth had been worn down even more and had completely disappeared in one part. The remains of the boards that had covered the opening were so old and soft that he pulled them off with ease. He lowered himself to the bottom the same way his father had, touching the ground much more lightly than he had previously. The cavity in the rocks was clear as day in front of him, dark and filled with shadows, though the sun was streaming down from the well's opening. He had no idea what lay beyond the opening, except bats. Many, many bats. In days past, a shudder would have coursed through him so violently it would have sent him scrambling back up the walls, but instead he pulled his overcoat around himself and crawled into the darkness. He started inching down an incline, but it steepened without warning and he slid the rest of the way, tumbling out at the bottom. When he turned on his flashlight, he found himself in a small cave carved into black rock, with a wide and shallow stream that drifted by him lazily. There wasn't a bat to be seen, but the stream did run into a tunnel in the wall, and whatever lay beyond was obscured by darkness. He took a deep breath of the heavy air and moved into it. He followed the stream all the way through into a space that was less a cave and more a cavern. The water cascaded down the rocky decline ahead of him and emptied into a large basin. He scaled the rocks to the bottom, but it barely helped him to see more. It seemed the place's edges and ceilings lay beyond the reach of his light, and the sounds of moving water echoed off of every wall. He stared in awe of the place. He felt as if he had just discovered some kind of new world, but then a slight wash of paranoia came over him. As if on cue, an entire colony of bats squealed. As if on cue, an entire colony of bats descended on him in a squealing black cloud. He refused to duck down, just as he had at the monastery, though these bats were extremely real. His father's words echoed in his head this time, and it occurred to him that they were probably just startled by the light, but he still flinched as he looked at them. There was just something about bats, he thought, that made them seem absolutely terrifying, even though they were never really trying to be. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. And that is the end of that chapter. I don't really have any feelings about this. This is just two separate scenes from the movie kind of stitched together. I think that that part was done pretty well, but none of the content of it really moved me. I've said pretty much everything that I needed to say about it as we were reading it. It was fine. Let's move on now to the next chapter, which is Rachel. Oh my god, we have another POV character. Who would have thought? The sky had gone gray as the day went on. It was cold, but not cold enough for snow, so the rain came down in sheets. Rachel watched the water pour down the windows as she leaned back into her chair and tried not to roll her eyes. For the third time, Dr. Crane had come to testify, and for the third time, he was trying to get one of Falcone's thugs sent to Arkham Asylum to be taken into his care, quote-unquote. She sighed. Did they really think she was that stupid? Crane was a sick, thin man with watery blue eyes whose clothes were 2 sizes too big. The "were" is missing there. She shook her head when he leaned forward again. In my opinion, Mr. Zaz is as much a danger to himself as he is to others, he said in his shaky voice, and prison is not the best environment for his rehabilitation. Zaz was nodding along with him in the dock. Maybe it was just her, but she could have sworn she had seen him smile. When they were dismissed, she hunted Crane down before he could exit the courthouse. The sound of her heels echoed hard across the marble as she stomped toward him. Dr. Crane, do you really think Victor Zaz shouldn't be in jail? He stopped and turned his big eyes on her. I would hardly have testified to that otherwise, would I, Miss Dawes? He teetered slightly on heels that had significant gaps at the backs. The work offered by organized crime has an attraction to the insane. Or the corrupt, she said, narrowing her eyes. He let out a sigh, and she crossed her arms. The first time made sense, and the second time she just took his word for it, but this time she wasn't just going to let this happen again. Mr. Finch, he said over her shoulder toward her boss's office, I think you should check with Miss Dawes here just what implications your office has allowed her to make, if any. He turned on his heel and marched toward the door. She, on the other hand, whipped around toward her boss. The only note that I really have about what we've read so far is the part where she mentions that Dr. Crane's clothes are just kind of like big because he's like super skinny. But then it mentions that his shoes are too big too. And that doesn't make sense to me because even though being skinny can mean that you might not fit a traditional shoe size like width-wise, even if you do length-wise, that's not going to make your shoes too big in the back because that's, again, the length. You could just buy smaller shoes. Anyway, let's keep going. What are you doing, Rachel? He asked. What are you doing, Carl? She said back. He jerked his head towards the office and she stropped through the door. I'm looking out for you, he said as he closed the door. Falcone's got half the city bought and paid for. Drop it. What? She spat in disgust. How can you say that? Because as much as I care about getting Falcone... He trailed off as he looked her right in the eye. I care more about you. Rachel sighed. That's sweet, but we've been through all this. She kissed him politely on the cheek and moved for the door. She could feel his eyes on her back as she left. So that's the end of that chapter. I kind of wish that chapter was a little bit longer because I liked that. Number one, it was just a nice change of pace to have a different character as the POV. And this is another reason why the back 2/3 of the story feel kind of like a different story than the first third, because now we are introducing other POV characters. We're going to have one more POV character that shows up, I think, in the chapter after next. So the story has a different feeling as we start cycling through POV characters versus the beginning, which is all the same person, all the same place, doing all the same things. And then there's flashbacks. There are no more flashbacks anymore. It really does feel like we've entered a new, if not a new phase of the story, at some point it's a completely different story, even though there are clear connections between the two parts. But yeah, I like that. Again, I wish there was a little bit more to it. It's I think both of the introduction chapters for the two, new POV characters are a little bit short. However, the other one feels more substantive. This feels like there could have been a lot more put into it that we could learn about, what's going on with Dr. Crane or what Rachel's been up to for the last, 7 years. I don't know, but it wasn't bad. I definitely got a feeling for Rachel as a character throughout it. So this next chapter is back to Bruce again. The walls shined in the same shade of cold blue as the sky as Bruce waited outside of the door. He found himself in a suit this morning, and if he was honest, he wasn't used to it. Ooh, get used to hearing if he was honest or if, like, she was honest throughout a lot of this. And I don't think it's as much of a thing in Batman Begins, but when we get to The Dark Knight Rises, oh boy. Oh god, it drives me nuts. It happens so often. It had been ages since he had a reason to dress up, and he had stopped wearing suits when he was young. They weren't him, quote unquote. But today was definitely a special occasion. It was the first day he was out of bed before noon. Cute. He allowed himself to linger in the hallway leading to the outer office under the guise of admiring the large comet orchid on one of the tables. The voices from the conference room traveled through the walls. I don't think Thomas Wayne would have viewed heavy arms manufacture as a suitable cornerstone of our business. He recognized Mr. Frederick's voice right away. He had met him the sole time he'd been to Wayne Tower in the past, and he'd been close friends with his father. There's a typo there. I think, Fredericks, after 20 years, we ought to be at the point where we stop asking ourselves what Thomas Wayne would have done. And that must have been Mr. Earl, he thought. Thomas Wayne wouldn't have wanted to take the company public either, but as responsible managers, that's what we're going to do. He was not surprised. He allowed himself to enter now. The sun streamed into the windows, casting a yellow glow on the glass surfaces and white walls. Outside, the bright light glinted off of skyscrapers dotting the skyline. Why is that "the" there? It doesn't need to be there. The secretary sat at a large desk, head bent down over a stack of papers, her thick hair curtaining her face. She didn't even bother to look up. Good morning, I'm here to see Mr. Earl, he said. Name? She asked with disinterest. Bruce Wayne. That got her attention. She looked up, and her big brown eyes went wide. Oh, of course, sir. He's in a meeting right now. Jessica, get me that prospectus, the intercom said beside her, but she didn't seem to notice. I can leave him a message if you like, if you don't want to wait. Jessica? Or I could just call him now. I mean, because, you know. The double doors finally opened to reveal Mr. Earl himself, still gray-haired and not all too happy. Jessica, who's answering the phones? She jumped halfway out of her seat. Oh, Mr. Earl, I'm so sorry. It's just that It's Wayne Enterprises, Bruce said to him now. I'm sure they'll call back. Mr. Earl looked up properly now, and his eyes widened in disbelief. Bruce? We thought you were dead. He could see the other board members leaning out of the door now. He didn't recognize any of their faces, save Mr. Frederick's. Bruce smiled at Jessica, who blushed deeply and returned it. Sorry to disappoint. Mr. Earl's office matched the decor of the rest of the building perfectly, everything dark and sleek and polished. Bruce reclined in the supple fabric of one of the black leather chairs. Mr. Earl leaned forward onto his desk with a mug of coffee in his hand. You realize it's too late to stop the public offering. I know, Bruce told him. I'll be handsomely rewarded for my shares. I'm not here to interfere. He saw Earl's shoulders lower in relief. Actually, I'm looking for a job. Earl raised an eyebrow. I just want to get to know the company my family built. Any idea where you would start? Applied science has caught my eye. Mr. Fox's department? He said with a shrug. Perfect. I'll make a call. Mr. Earl handed him off to Mr. Fox, a tall brown-skinned man with graying, dark brown hair, who led him down to the basement, a seemingly large room lit only by a few lights behind them, a single lamp far off in the corner, and the glow of computer screens. Absolutely unnecessary. That did not need to be one sentence. Even if you cut that off after the description of Fox, the following sentence still would have been a little bit too long. Everything that lay between them and that single lamp lay in darkness. Environmental applications, defense projects, consumer products. Mr. Fox started as he scrolled down the screen. All prototypes, none in production at any level whatsoever. Bruce tilted his head. None? What did they tell you this place was? Fox asked, looking up at him. Bruce shrugged. They didn't tell me anything. Earl told me exactly what it was when he sent me down here. He hit the lights, revealing a room full of shapes covered in white sheets and tables filled with various instruments. The bright white industrials reflected dully off of the gray concrete walls. It's a dead end, he said, gesturing towards the covered shapes. They didn't want me to cause any more trouble for the board. He motioned for Bruce to follow him through the concrete pillars. You were on the board? Bruce asked. He nodded, and then added, back when your father ran things. You knew my father? It didn't seem too implausible. Mr. Fox was an older man, probably the same age his father would be now. Sure, I helped him build his train. Ah, here we are. They stopped at a table covered with heavy containers, and he opened one and pulled out a harness and a black grappling gun. Pneumatic, magnetic grapple, monofilament tested to 350 pounds. The gun was light but strong and sturdy, and the wide belt of the harness had a dark gold metallic finish, with thick shoulder straps that ended with gray buckles. If he was honest, they seemed a bit ungainly. Do you see what I mean? They keep saying, if he was honest. Like, I don't know why that specific turn of phrase was so, like, appealing to me back then, but it shows up not just in this, but also in some other stuff that I wrote around the same time. I swear I remember reading that in another one of these recordings that I did last year in 2018 that I'm probably gonna end up doing again, and I felt like I was being fucking haunted. Fox beckoned him toward a heavy metal container now. Beautiful project, your dad's train, he continued on. Rooted right into Wayne Tower, along with the water and power utilities. Made it the unofficial heart of Gotham City. Of course, Earl's left it to rot. You know, I find it kind of weird that he's talking about the train in past tense, because that train definitely does still exist. Oh god, I shouldn't really get into the weeds about this, because this was written in 2013 when I had only taken approximately 1.5 buses in my entire life. But does Gotham City not have other forms of public transit, like, that bus system that we have across our entire fucking state? I don't know. I just think it's like weird that like, and I will say though, of course, NJ Transit was founded, I think in 1979. So when the flashback chapter, the first one where Bruce's parents died happened, I think that happened in the 80s. So I guess back then it kind of makes sense that, yeah, they don't have a like train system going through anything. Cause number one, NJ Transit doesn't do like, within the city train systems. That's more of like a thing you'd find with SEPTA, which is the public transit service that services southeastern Pennsylvania. But like in the modern day, it is very strange to me that in the lieu of this train system basically being like rotted to crap, that there are not a shit ton of NJ Transit buses running through this city. Hey guys, editing Frankie here with not so much as a correction, but with an alteration of some information that I was about to share. So at this point, I went on to talk about the fact that despite me living in the suburbs, my town is serviced by a bunch of buses. So it's weird that Gotham City would not also be serviced by a bunch of buses. However, the only reason that Pennsauken is serviced by so many buses is because my town, A, which I did mention, sits directly north of Camden, and B, sits on top of 3 separate state highways. So basically, with the exception of one bus which has a roundabout route because it is a local bus route, every bus going to Burlington County from Camden passes through my town because it has to. So Pensauken's not really the best point of comparison for this because of how many highways there are. I was thinking that a better comparison would be like Atlantic City, but even Atlantic City sits at the end of 3 major highways. But still, that would be a better point of comparison because Atlantic City is not in exactly the same place, but it's on the same side of the state and is still like a fairly major city within the state. So it is weird that Gotham City isn't serviced by at least a handful of buses, plus maybe that one bus that runs north from Atlantic City to, I think, Lakewood. Don't quote me on that. I don't know the name of the town, but there is a bus, I think, that runs north from Atlantic City that isn't the 319. But anyway, the point being that it is just kind of weird that people treat this train like it is the only source of transportation when we do have a statewide bus system that would service what seems to be the largest city in our entire state in this world. So it's just a little bit weird. But anyway, let's get back to it. He opened a drawer and changed subjects again. The Nomex survival suit for advanced infantry, Kevlar bi-weave reinforced joints. The suit was colored a deep gray and separated into 2 separate parts, and armor plated over the arms and legs and up the neck. Okay, again, that needed to be 2 different sentences. One thing I just do not understand about this story, and multiple stories that I wrote back in 2013, is what possessed me to think that a singular sentence needed to have all this information in it. Like, did I not understand that you could talk about one thing across multiple sentences or something? It's just very, very strange. I don't get it. Is it tear resistant? Bruce asked. Fox pulled a pen from his pocket and stabbed at the shoulder plate. The tip didn't even leave a dent. This sucker will stop a knife. Bulletproof? Fox shrugged. Anything but a straight shot. Bruce picked it up himself. The material was strong and resilient, hard as plastic in some places and weaved like tight fabric in others. It had its own beauty in a way. He could almost see himself in it. Why didn't they put it into production, he asked. The bean counters figured a soldier's life wasn't worth the 300 grand. He paused for a moment. So, what do you want with it, Mr. Wayne? I want to borrow it for spelunking. Mr. Fox raised an eyebrow. You know, cave diving? You expect him to run into much gunfire in these caves? Fox asked incredulously. Sharp rocks, Bruce said with a chuckle as Fox closed the drawer. Listen, I'd rather Mr. Earl didn't know about this. Fox shrugged again. The way I see it, all this stuff is yours anyway. And that's the end of that chapter. Number one, no, that's not how that works. Just because Bruce owns the company does not mean that he owns all the stuff that it doesn't get made by it and given to other people. Of course, I think that line is a joke. But anyway, so that chapter was all right. We're starting to see now sort of the issue with cutting out a lot of the scene transitions. Like, the part with Fox feels a little bit out of place because, like, Fox is showing him what it is, like, what the place is, and without the cut between the scene to him showing Bruce all this different stuff, it's really weird because it seems like he just starts showing him around and picks up these things, and never at any point do we see Bruce say, like, hey, can you show me these things? Like, what's going on down here? What is all this shit? I'd like to see some stuff that I want for this, you know? Because all of a sudden, like, he's just like, oh, this is a dead end. And then he starts walking around showing Bruce shit. And it's like, why? What? I don't get it. Even if Bruce doesn't have to, like, say what he wants right at the start of that sequence, there had to be a smoother way to convey what was going on, you know? But otherwise, I don't have a lot of strong feelings about the chapter. I did think the part with Jessica was kind of funny. Also, pin Jessica just as a character because she's gonna come back in a later story. But outside of that, this chapter wasn't super, like, interesting to me. It is important for setting up what's about to happen, but, you know. So let's move on to the next chapter, which is Jim Gordon, our other POV character. Gordon was getting tired of Flass's bullshit. Or maybe he was always tired of Flass, but at this point he couldn't tell. Ooh, coming right out the gate with the curse words. You know, if there's one thing that I think is really funny about this story, it's that this story doesn't have a lot of cursing, and the cursing is really mild. Like, I don't think there's anything more extreme than damn and ass. And, like, just pin that for when we get to the fucking Dark Knight Rises. Because things take, like, a big turn in that story. It's kind of ridiculous. But moving on. He'd asked for him to just drop him at the station, to not make him sit through this, but Flass insisted. If he went back to the station alone, they'd arouse suspicion, quote unquote. So there he sat, in the car outside of Falcone's place, just waiting. If he had his way, Flass wouldn't even be on the force, but if he had his way, the police force would be short a couple thousand officers. Foreshadowing? We just don't know. He could never understand, really, the appeal of the underworld. Actually, he thought maybe he could. Money is appealing to many, but he could never know how it was. He could never know what it was for it to be the only option, which for many people in this town it was. Flass had other options, though. We're middle-aged white guys, he'd told him once. We got all the opportunities, but the allure of ease is what got him. The most profit for the least amount of work. So that's interesting. It says something, I think, that this is kind of the only social commentary that we get in the story. I mean, outside of the social commentary that's kind of inherited from the source material, that is really the only, like, very pointed thing that we hear about, like, the situation in Gotham and how, like, certain people are just taking advantage of things while other people are actually forced to do things. That's interesting. And I wish we heard a little bit more about stuff like that, or if this story explored that a bit more, you know? It goes back to what I said last episode when I was talking about how the conversation with Ra's al Ghul before Bruce blew up the monastery, and how they mentioned that, like, oh, you know, destroying a city is the only way to cleanse it of its filth, but in reality, the corruption in Gotham stems from much deeper sources than anything to do with Gotham City itself. And I wish this story would talk about it. That's why, like, for as much as I think The Dark Knight Rises kind of misses the mark, and of course we'll talk about that more when we actually get to that story, I am glad that the story does attempt to actually talk about something, because this story has all of this stuff that it could comment on, and then it just kind of doesn't, and it's kind of weird. But moving on. Finally, Flass exited the club and entered the car. He looked at Gordon out of the side of his eye as he stuffed a wad of cash into his pocket. "Don't suppose you want a taste?" he asked as he started the car. "Nothing wise in what you do," Jim said with a sigh. "Yeah? Well, Jimbo, you don't take your taste. It makes us guys nervous you might roll over." Jim rolled his eyes. "I'm no rat, Flass," he scoffed. "Besides, in a town this bent, who's there to rat to anyway?" Flass barked out a laugh and nodded in agreement. Jim only frowned. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and Jim went straight to his office once Flass dropped him off. The asshole sped off as soon as he got out of the car. "So much for not raising suspicions," he muttered under his breath as he mounted the stairs. He dropped into the office chair and let out a heavy sigh. Every day felt longer and longer, even though it was supposed to be going the other way now that winter was here. I kind of like that. No one ever said it'd be easy, he thought to himself, but he also wondered if it should be this hard. One thing I will say about both of these, this and The Dark Knight Rises, is that it does manage to make me sympathize with cops. So that's something. Jim straightened when the lights went out. The yellow streetlight still streamed in through the window behind him, and he knew immediately that something wasn't right. He started to rise from his chair, but he felt something press into his back between his shoulder blades and froze. "Don't turn around," someone growled behind him. "What do you want?" Jim asked warily. "You're a good cop, one of the few. Carmine Carmine Falcone brings in shipments of drugs every week and nobody takes him down. Why?" His brow furrowed. That wasn't the question he was expecting. He's paid up with the right people. What would it take to bring him down? Leverage on Judge Faden, and after a moment he added, "and a DA brave enough to prosecute him." Rachel Dawes in the DA's office. Now he was the one asking questions. "Oh, who are you?" "Watch for my sign." "You're just one man?" "Now we're two." He felt the pressure lift from his back. "We?" He got no answer. Jim whipped around to find nothing but an open window. When he looked out, he could see a black figure scrambling up the wall to the roof. He went running out of the room, groping his hip for his gun. He heard two officers follow after him once he hit the stairwell. Jim had his gun drawn when they came bursting through the rooftop door. "Freeze!" But the guy had already jumped. He almost didn't make it. He missed the edge of the roof, and they heard him slam into a fire escape. They ran to the edge. One of the railings was lying on the ground, but the guy was gone. "Jim, what the hell was that?" "Some nut." But he wasn't so sure. And that's the end of that chapter. Like I said, this introductory chapter is way more substantial than Rachel's, even if it is a little bit short. I think it shows the difference between a short chapter and a chapter that's too short. I actually like that a lot. I think this is easily the best of the chapters that we've read so far. It's cohesive, it makes sense, there's not any weird like jumps or anything because of missing cuts. Everything flows together. We learn a bunch about the character, and it makes me really sad because this is easily Jim's best chapter in the entire story. One thing I will say is that Jim definitely, throughout this gets the short end of the stick because I don't understand cop things. So a lot of times when there is supposed to be police procedural things happening, Jim is just kind of wandering around crime scenes like, wow, this sure is weird. And that's it. Which again sucks because like this chapter sets him up as a pretty compelling character, and the fact that his content just kind of doesn't measure. There's actually one other chapter that Jim gets that's kind of like short, but is still a little bit interesting later on in the story, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So overall, that wasn't bad at all, I don't think. And quite frankly, it's literally, I think, the only chapter that has any kind of social commentary in it, which I enjoyed. I like his little comment about like, we're middle-aged white guys, we got all the opportunities, like hashtag woke Jim. God. But let's keep going. So I'm gonna move on to this next Bruce chapter. I think this may be the last one we read. I'm not entirely sure, but let's go to it. Bruce hadn't expected himself back so soon, but after his quote-unquote accident at the police station, he realized he wasn't as prepared as he thought he was. He could feel eyes on him as he made his way to the bottom of the building, no thanks to the slight limp he was sporting, but as long as Fox didn't notice, he didn't much care. It wasn't like the rest of them would know how he got it, anyway. "What is it today, Mr. Wayne? More spelunking?" Fox asked as he removed his glasses. Bruce shook his head. "No, base jumping." Base jumping? Like parachuting?" Bruce shrugged. Sort of. You have any lightweight fabrics?" Mr. Fox smiled. "Oh, yeah." See, this time, Bruce comes in, he asks Fox for something, Fox is like, "Oh, I got something for that," and then they go and they look at it. there is a sense of, like continuity there. Instead of like, oh, I helped your dad build his train. Here's a gun. Anyway, your train. Like, but moving on. Fox led him into the space once more, this time to a Fox led him into the space once more, this time to a table covered in heavy black cases. Memory fabric, he told him as he opened one of them, pulling out a medium-weight fabric colored a very deep black. Notice anything? It didn't look like anything special, except how dark it was, but then he noticed Fox putting on a glove. It's flexible ordinarily, but put a current through it. He touched his glove hand to the fabric, and the thing jumped up into the shape of a small tent. The molecules align and become rigid. It was impressive. The thing felt smooth like plastic, but not as hard. When he pushed at it, it didn't collapse. It barely even shook. What kind of shapes can you make? He asked. It can be tailored to any structure based on a rigid skeleton, Fox told him, and that was absolutely perfect. Fox removed his hand, and the fabric fell back to its original state. Bruce picked it up for himself. It was lighter in his hands than it looked, and was just as smooth as it was when it was rigid. It really was perfect. He couldn't think of any reason why anyone would put it to use. Well, maybe one. Too expensive for the army, he asked. Mr. Fox shrugged. Guess they never thought about marketing to the billionaire base-jumping crowd. Bruce bit his tongue. Oh, that's gotta be painful. Look, Mr. Fox, if you're uncomfortable... Mr. Wayne, if you don't tell me what you're really doing, then when I'm asked, I don't have to lie. He looked Bruce right in the eye. But don't take me for a fool. Bruce bit his lip and then nodded. It was bound to happen someday. He was set to go back upstairs when something behind Fox caught his eye. It was some kind of vehicle. He could tell by the wheels peeking out from under the tarp. Too long and low to be a proper truck, but too big to be a car. What's that? He said, nodding towards it. Fox turned. Oh, the tumbler? She was built as a bridging vehicle. Never could get the bridge to work, but the vehicle runs just fine. He paused a moment, and then a grin spread across his face. You wouldn't be interested in that. Oh, he would be very interested in that. And that's the end of that chapter. That's kind of funny. So yeah, this chapter, I think it does what the other chapter wanted to do a bit better. At least the part with Fox, anyway. The stuff with Earl in that other chapter wasn't so bad. Very short, but it covers something that I think we did need to see. It is a little weird that this little tidbit is off by itself when everything else is, like, up in the other chapter, but at the same time, the whole point is that him going to Gordon is supposed to be, like, his first outing, and then he kind of, like, fucks up. So then he goes back, and he's like, I gotta go back to the drawing board, which leads into the next chapter, which I will actually read. And this will be the last chapter we read for this episode, because even though it does lead nicely into the one after that, that chapter has like a chapter that goes after it, and that chapter is also quite long, so for the sake of time, we're gonna cut it after this one. So yeah, that chapter wasn't bad, but we're moving on now to another Bruce chapter. Once he finally got to hang some lights around the place, Bruce realized that the cave was somehow even more massive than he thought it was. I feel like that Bruce should have happened earlier in that sentence, but anyway. The caves touched the southernmost end of the house, right underneath the study, and for a while, he didn't know how far it went in the other direction. Alfred had told him that his family had been involved in the Underground Railroad and that the caves were probably very useful, and he nodded in agreement because he'd known that. That was how his great-grandfather had met his great-grandmother, but somehow he'd missed the part about the cave. I do want to note, if you remember, I think it was last episode, I mentioned that, Gotham City is on the coast of New Jersey, down near Atlantic City. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here with another correction. So I said here that Gotham City was in the Great Egg Harbor something or other. There is a Great Egg Harbor inlet on the coast, but it's further south near Ocean City. Where Gotham City is called the Great Bay, and it is sandwiched between Little Egg Harbor Township, Bass River, and Port Republic. And then Beach Haven is also like northeast, and Brigantine is southeast. So that's where Gotham City is. It is north of Atlantic City, but it's not that far north. So Gotham City's on the coast. We don't have rocks in New Jersey, and what I mean by that is, like, if you go to Philadelphia, literally, and go to, like, Fairmount Park, you'll see that there are, like, rock formations and stuff. Cross the river, come to New Jersey in the same exact place, it is flat, there is dirt, there is no rocks. That's what I mean. We don't have rock formations in this part of New Jersey. The only place where that kind of stuff is way up in North Jersey, especially around in the corner where the mountains are. But once you hit, like, Central and South Jersey, it is dirt. That is it. So the fact that there is a cave underneath Wayne Manor is very, very strange. The story, of course, never points this out because, and I did that on purpose because when I had wrote this, I had just come off of changing majors from being a geology major to going to graphic design, which is what I do now. So most people who aren't geology majors don't know that. But for the few people that do, I didn't mention it because Bruce is also not a geology person. So to him, this is like whatever, it's just rocks. But I did plan to have at some point, I think Peter, which is weird because Peter does biology, but to have Peter mention like, why the fuck do you have a cave under your house? There are no caves around here. There is no rock. But that's supposed to be just like a little tidbit that is supposed to throw it off for like certain people while other people just kind of cruise by it, which I kind of like. It is a little weird that a mystery in the story would be cut off from some people due to a lack of knowledge, but that kind of thing happens and I don't mind it. But let's keep going. He set up shop in a space under the old brick foundations of the house and got to work immediately. The very first thing he did was build an elevator that went into the house because coming down through the well wasn't going to cut it anymore. There had apparently been one there before, so he had his work cut out for him. I don't think that's what that phrase means, but whatever. After that, he went to work on the suit. He lost the straps on the harness and repainted everything. The things he had reflected too much light, so he made everything matte black, from the armor to the tumbler that he'd gotten his hands on. He only wished they could be as dark as the memory fabric. It absorbed every light that shone on it, and it blended so well into the shadows that he almost lost it once. He needed a mask to cover his face, but he wanted something with more personality than a ski mask, so after using roundabout methods to avoid suspicion in a shipment that quite literally wasn't up to bat, he made a cowl that made Alfred uncomfortable just at the sight of it, which meant that it must have been good. That is one sentence. That is one sentence. That is literally like a short paragraph. That is one sentence. Oh my god. Moving on. Alfred became worried that he was spending too much time down there, and Bruce brushed it off as paranoia until he realized how comfortable the place was and how bold he was getting, though maybe that was for the better. I mean, yeah, but also how comfortable, quote-unquote, the place was. It's a cave. It's filled with water and bats. How comfortable can it be? I mean, I know, I think caves keep in heat better than, like, flat land, so that's a thing, and it is winter. But, like, it's wet! It's wet down there. It started with the largest tunnel, the one that set directly across the basin from the foundations, with a narrow but deep stream that ran down it. When he came down there one day, he saw that there was a light at the end of it, and he got curious. The tunnel was long but straight, and only inclined enough so that the water would travel to its end. The rocks under his feet had been smoothed by the water, and the jagged ceiling was covered with the withered remains of what looked like 100 vines. Pin the vines. Eventually, the tunnel emptied him into the woods, a tangle of bare trees and evergreen shrubs. The stream continued down a stony incline and into a small pond, its edges littered with dead leaves that decayed into the dirt. The place would be beautiful in the spring, he thought. Also pin that. As time went on, he gathered the courage to explore the smaller caves, and most of what he found was water and bats. Hundreds and hundreds of bats. There seemed to be thousands like the ones that lived on the ceiling of the main cave, and gigantic ones with large eyes and wings that were almost as long as he was tall, that liked to mess with the chains on the old dumbwaiter, which made them echo all over the walls. Why, Alfred had asked him one day, why the bat, Master Wayne? He grimaced as he watched them crawl among the stalactites. He seemed to hate the things more than Bruce did. They scare me, Bruce answered with a small smile. It's time my enemies shared my dread. And that is where we are ending that. That chapter wasn't bad. Nothing, and I don't want to say nothing happened. Because, like, it's not a big event that pushes the plot forward, but this chapter is important because I used to call this chapter the What You Missed in the Batcave chapter because it kind of just goes over all of the rest of the stuff that Bruce does to prepare for his first actual outing as Batman. And I think that's very important. I also don't mind the stuff where he's like telling us about the history of his family, us exploring the caves and seeing like the stuff outside of it and learning about the bats and stuff. Like, I don't mind any of that stuff at all. I think that chapter was a little bit short, but I think for that chapter it was okay because it was pretty much all prose, so it seemed shorter than it actually is. So the quality of the chapters was kind of up and down. It went from to all right. So I think I might just not give overall ratings anymore because it seems like that's going to be a trend throughout this, that the chapters are like very back and forth for me. I don't think any of the chapters we read today were bad. I just definitely liked some more than others. So next episode, we are moving to a chapter that is actually told in third person. This is something that literally only happens in this story for reasons that I will probably not be able to explain properly until we get all the way to the Dark Knight Rises. But it is the first outing as Batman, though. But it is very specifically not told from Bruce's POV on purpose. We'll talk about that more later, though. So yeah, if you like this episode, don't forget to, my stomach is growling. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video and stuff. And I will see you for the next episode. Bye.